Well, thank you very much for watching the Sullivan's Projects Spacefest 2017 Spacefest 8 Special Part Number 4. And here we're going to get into the shuttle program. It started out with altitude and landing test out in Dryden with the Enterprise. And one that actually was built earlier turned out to be the Challenger, converted from STA-99 as a wing load test article to a real shuttle. Enterprise was never converted. Columbia actually rolled out first. Columbia was the one that I saw the least of, because I saw most of mine after 1992, and I did see a couple launches with Columbia. It's markedly different than the other ones. First of all, it's much heavier. The bricks and everything were much heavier than the thermal blankets they had used on the later shuttles. And so you can always tell Columbia has a little triangle on the leading wings, and it's a black triangle. And also, shortly after they built it, on the top of the tail, you can always see a little bulb, looks like a little projection sticking out from the top of the front of the tail. And that's what makes Columbia so much different than the other ones. Challenger, Atlantis were pretty much carbon copies of each other. There were a lot of updates when they built Endeavour, basically out of spare parts from the program, on the cheap, to replace Challenger after it was lost. Now, everybody knows I wasn't really a big fan of the space shuttle after the 1986 Challenger disaster. I thought back then if they would have started with what they have now with United Launch Alliance and SLS program, we probably would have been on the moon a long time ago. But that's even Mars. That's neither here nor there. It is what it is. I'm glad the Ares program got canceled. Hoping they can get SLS to fly. I actually like that one a lot better. Even though they use the same camera angles all the time on the long-range trackers at the Kennedy Space Center, and also at the landing site, both at Kennedy and Edwards, it looks on TV like a lot of these launches are all the same, but they're really not. I've been to 38 of them myself, and every one of them looks different. The ones that go to like where the Hubble orbit is, launch on a southeasterly track out of Kennedy on a 28.5 degree inclination, and that kind of takes it like this way, not really on the equator, but not really polar either. It's, about it lines up with where Kennedy Space Center is at 28.5 degrees, and so that's the most common natural place to launch out of Kennedy for the shuttle. It takes a lot more fuel, and you can carry a lot less mass if you go into the polar orbit at 51.6 degrees where the station is. And I also see on some of these flights, even before the station was built, that they had also gone in that same orbit. I don't know why, but I did see that a couple times, so it's one of the things I'm going to ask Gibson about, because one of his launches before the station went up was up on that orbit. The good thing about that orbit is you can see much more of the Earth from that perspective, and you have 2 chances a day to launch to meet the shuttle in a launch window. Normally it's just once a day, actually, in the ascending node takeoff, because they never took off to the southeast. I guess they could have, but they didn't. I know that there's a couple of countries. I know Japan's one, and I think Wallops here in America is another one, where they can hit that 51.6 heading on a descending node, which means heading down to the south on launch instead of up to the north. But when it went up to the north, you could see that thing at night go all the way up the eastern seaboard as it climbed to orbit. So, without further ado, we're going to probably end up breaking this one into 2 parts, but here's part 3 of the Sullivan's Projects Spacefest 8 Special 2017 edition. God bless, thanks.
Well, welcome once again to Spacefest 8 2017, Part 3. And welcome to America, Robert Brand. I hear he's here. We're going to see Fred Hayes again. The first time I met him back in 2013, I said, "Oh yeah, you're that famous guy who popped off a 747 in an unpowered glider for the first time and didn't take the tail off and didn't crash." This was really a very dangerous project. Looks like the T-38 is a lot more safer and fun to fly. That's an old Pan Am 747. NASA bought it, renamed it NASA 905. 911, ironically enough, was the second one. Both were later used to ferry the craft between California back to the Kennedy Space Center. And I guess White Sands too. There it goes. And I was a kid in grade school playing hooky, watching this live on the NBC. It was so exciting for me as a space nut, even when I was a young kid, to watch America's space program back in business again after the end of Skylab and Apollo-Soyuz. And you may not know this, but Walter Cunningham, who flew on Apollo 7, actually stayed with NASA and became a bigwig with the Skylab program. With the program itself, and he was in charge of the astronauts assigned to that program. And so I think by now Walter Cunningham had retired, but here's Enterprise making its left-hand turn, and T-38 as well, and just a wonderful program. They took that telecone off for the last, I think, 2 flights and almost flipped the darn thing once. This is before they had microwave systems and everything that they have in later days. It was all based on good old-fashioned VFR pilot skills in a plane that had a 3 or 4 second delay in wing response and rudder response and elevon response to the inputs you were feeding into the joystick. Made another left-hand turn. Obviously, they didn't use the rudder because it looks pretty attached to the telecone, but they did use the elevons and the speed brake, or the rudder for this one. But this is where I know Fred Hayes was from this awesome flight in Enterprise. First time the space shuttle ever flew and landed successfully. And this is based on things they learned from the lifting body program and the X-15, probably more the lifting bodies. They did pretty much the same approach as the HL-10 M2F2, and that's wonderful. Dryden Flight Research Center connected to Edwards Air Force Base, and they land on the Rogers Dry Lake bed on the same places, same runways that the lifting bodies in the X-15 were flying on. Major General Joe Engle, the X-15 pilot bump from Apollo 17, was involved with the second flight, and once again coming into Rogers Dry Lake bed, Edwards Air Force Base, connected to the NASA Dryden facility. Here they are landing, pretty much repeating the same history he had made in the X-15. This time he didn't land on the skids, but he landed as successfully. Wheels down and flare maneuver, just like in the old X-15 days. Just bringing it in nice and slow. Nice and slow. And main gear touchdown. And nose gear touchdown. Rolling out on runway, I guess, 17. Finally, they got the shuttle after many delays flying again. And the only reason I put this in here is Robert Brand and Ed Rezek had provided a lot of support for STS-1. This is also the first test of a new design with men aboard. Back in 2003, I asked John Young about those ejection seats, and he goes, once we saw those boosters and what they did, we knew we were never going to use those seats. They would rather try to land by good luck from a disintegrating craft than to try to get caught up in those boosters. They had no idea those boosters would put out that much heat and energy. And anybody trying to eject out of what later became the top windows of the crew cabin would definitely be in for a really sorry time trying to get out of this thing. It's quite, one of my things that I really like about Orion and the CST with Boeing is they've returned some capability in the event of a catastrophic malfunction to survive. And here we are with number 2 again with General Joe Engel, who will be at Spacefest. I can't wait to meet the guy. First time a spaceship was ever relaunched for reuse in space. Here we have Colonel Jack Ura, and he had a really great flight, really photogenic launch. And as things turned out, because of the weather at both Kennedy and Dryden, he ended up making the first and only landing at White Sands, New Mexico, which was the third site out of orbit. Once again, beautiful launch. The cameras are a lot better right now. If you ever see them in person, they pretty much look all the same as far as the quality that you see with your own eyes, that are always much better than what you see on TV. However, don't let that fool you. They're just using the same camera angles every time from the long-range trackers, except for something like that. And what happens is you kind of just get used to the same routine over and over and over again, but each shuttle launch has different weather, a different crew, a different mission, and actually the look on all 38 I saw was completely different, which is why I was able to film 28. They all look very much different, no matter what the camera angles are showing you from the NASA side. There go the solids, and here comes Jack bringing the shuttle in for the one and only landing. Looks like that's to the south at White Sands, New Mexico. It's so nice to get them over in this part of the country. I don't know about landing sites, but I know Cochise County's got a lot of places between here and Benson, here meaning Sierra Vista, where they'd be able to launch almost any company that wants to go up. And here they are making the flare maneuver. And they always tried to go into the wind, and there were a lot of gusts like there always are out here in the desert. Well, Sierra Vista isn't really a desert, but White Sands certainly is. Gear down. You can really see the gusts there. Main gear touchdown. Almost. Nose gear touchdown. Almost. And she goes back up because of the gust, and he brings it back down, and there's your nose gear touchdown. Because of this problem on this one flight, you see where the rudders are split on the tail. They put a parachute later on there to keep that from repeating itself in case they hit gust up on landing. And welcome to beautiful White Sands, New Mexico. Here's Commander Vance Brand. He was from STS. I don't even think he flew the shuttle before. This must be his first flight. But he flew the Apollo Soyuz mission. And so he's one of the few people that's really fun to talk to when you ask him to compare the differences between the Apollo Saturn 1B and the Shuttle, and his answerings are really staggering. He's well known in Navy circles. The plane I flew on in 4 years, for 4 years in the Navy. He actually was the Lockheed contractor, just like Scott Crossfield was for the X-15, who developed and did the first flights aboard the Navy P-3. And so we know who he was very well in the Navy, even before his space missions. Just an awesome pilot, really nice guy. And if you ever get a chance to go up and shake his hand, certainly do. I think he flew, in addition to the Apollo mission, he commanded 3 shuttle missions, and we'll get to all those later. That's what I'm talking about when I say I don't think John Young was too impressed when he saw the footage of what was going on behind him, because those ejection seats would not be very promising for survival. Not in that furnace. What you're seeing is actually explosive rubber. The solids are actually just that, and as time goes on, they hollow out, just like a candle would over time, and then there's nothing left as the outer casing is what the fuel that's burning out, and it'll just over time run out of fuel. The thrust will go down to almost 1 G's, and that's when you start getting more power from the 3 main shuttle engines connected to the orbiter. That's a really safe time to ditch those things, and they had a much better ride after that. There they go. Sometimes the explosion of the pyrotechnics, when those things went, would fog up the windows for the pilots, but they could always see through them, I guess, like we would with a bunch of butterflies in our windshield. And here we are landing at Edwards, and as you can tell, they attempted a runway landing this time, and that would be probably runway, I'm going to guess, based on what I just saw, probably runway 22. What a really great guy Vance is. And here we are with the Space Shuttle Challenger. Commander was Captain Paul Weitz, United States Navy. Also, we had on the same flight another person we're going to see at Spacefest, as well as Mr. White, Colonel Bob, and here they are launching on another beautiful Florida day. This view's to the northwest. I apologize. That's from the east. That's from the southwest. I mean. And there goes Challenger on one of its very first and most successful flights. It was really a great vehicle. They had redesigned basically the shuttle and made it much lighter, and as a result, this was also followed by Discovery and Atlantis later on, and even more changes were made to Endeavour after this one was lost. The one thing that you can see as time goes on, other than the fact that you see a lot more crew activity and things going on from inside the crew's perspective, is this view does get a lot better over time. It's the same thing going on with what the pilots are saying, pretty much. What the ops, avionics, and the general purpose computer aboard the shuttle are doing. Pretty much the same thing all the way through the program as far as what's really going on. But what we see down here on the ground, as recorded by the technology available at the time, looks just a lot better over time. But still, this is just a magnificent view. And because there's 2 people at Spacefest that were on this crew, I expect to see a lot of reunion pictures taking place That's pretty much what you see from the ground, from the Banana Causeway area. And there you can see the solids are burning out. They'll soon be separated. And Challenger goes back up with one of my favorite people who was never actually hired by NASA, but he was always contracted to fly aboard her. Charlie Walker is just an awesome guy. He lives here in Arizona, and the more you can chat with him, the more you like the guy. Even back then, he was like one of those media darlings because his personality and sense of humor and wit were just so great. He's also a really smart guy, and I think he ended up working as a lobbyist for the aerospace industry with the Senate. What you're looking at here is a night landing, and so you can see the carbon reinforced carbon nose cone there turning red hot still, even though they're already well into the atmosphere. By the way, they didn't have these things, this kind of technology inside. They just went by IFR rules and DME and got themselves to the runway. And by the looks of it, I really couldn't tell you where this is yet, but I'm going to guess it may be runway 4 at Edwards. That's what it looks like from here. Runway landing to the east. Houston, wheels stopped. This next one will be one of our biggest reunions at Spacefest for a crew, STS-10, otherwise known as 41B, also Challenger. This is Vance Brand on his second flight. The very famous Hoot Gibson on his first. And also on his first, another Navy captain, Bruce McCandless. And this is when we start seeing stuff happening up in space. You got to remember, they didn't have any kind of satellites in orbit when the program started out. There's Mr. McCandless, Hoot right there, and beautiful view on the launch pad. So they spent a lot of the early first missions just getting the teeter satellites up there, the tracking data and relay satellites, because the problem was they didn't really have very good communications with the ground in orbit at the time, and they figured out if they could bounce off of geosynchronous satellites that they would be able to stay in contact, except for some very brief periods of LOS or loss of signal, which got less and less as time went on, and they got more assets up there, even KU band relays and stuff like that. So NASA launched its own geostationary satellites to provide a almost down to ground, up to space, down to the ground relay for these things when they were up there. Just a beautiful launch, like most of them were. One time I was on the Midway, that's Nelson right there, a congressman. One day I was out on the Midway, out in the Pacific Ocean, or probably the Indian Ocean, I can't remember which one. And these guys were so bored they got onto a common frequency, full of Navy guys up there. They knew these frequencies by heart, and they gave us a call down into our space, and we couldn't believe it. We thought it was a prank, but after a while, we're like, yeah, that's really them. And they gave us a call. We chatted for a while, and 10 minutes later, they were over the horizon and on their way to the next ground station or station out at sea. So here we are at our first good look. This is the Challenger. Ron McNair, who would later die on the Challenger, was a very famous astronaut, well liked in the astronaut corps. And like I said, the first part of the shuttle mission was just to launch communication satellites and stuff like that. Sometimes they were on DoD missions. That's why you don't see any film at all from their time up there. and they got their 2 satellites off and had a really good time up there. And one thing you can see over the years, in addition to the replacement of the cockpit with a glass cockpit, is you can see a lot of new computers added to the cockpit area. These guys were still living in 1978 designs as far as the structure itself, and that was true all the way to the end of the program. Like an old frame on and an old body on an old car that after 35 years, there's Vance. After 35 years, you can put in new systems, new car stereos, new tires and stuff like that, but it was still an old design. So in time, it kind of wore out. And there's Hoot by the airlock in the back. As many bad things you hear about Challenger, it was actually one of the better built craft. It just got attached to the wrong stack on the day it was lost. The news said there was an explosion. There really wasn't an explosion. What happened was there's Vance again. There was it pretty much broke apart. First of all, at the between the cockpit and mid-deck area and the payload bay, and then the wing snapped, and that was pretty much it. They didn't stand a chance. But word is that this guy here would live all the way to the ground when it hit nose first at 280 miles an hour, but it didn't have any parachutes aboard. They had removed all sorts of evacuation systems, and as John Young had observed, it's a risk you take. You sign up for it. That's what he told me in 2003 after Columbia was lost. You just got to take your chances and hope for the best. And there's a lot of guys that, as dangerous as it was, and as many things as NASA could have done better, maybe, it is what it is. And there's Captain McCandless getting ready to do what he's most famous at, and that would be suiting up to go outside. And there they are in the airlock waiting for pressurization to go down. And there they are out in the payload bay. I got to tell you though, when Challenger was lost, I really became not so much a fan of the program. I just thought that by then it had been almost a decade since the design had been implemented. I just thought there was so many more ways to just shut down the program and move everything over to a new design that was maybe less dangerous. And here is history being made in the world's smallest manned spacecraft ever. And this is Bruce in an MMU suit is what they call it, but it had its own jetpacks and everything, and as you can tell, maybe, he is floating completely untethered at 17,500 miles an hour in a convoy in orbit with the shuttle. And we learn later on there's a couple of risks in doing this, especially if you get to a different orbital altitude. What happens in that case is one of you is going to go off a little bit ahead of the ship, and the other one will be going a little bit slower. But somehow they stay together and within range. But it's just a beautiful mission this was. And Bruce is just such a nice guy. We really had a really funny joke last time we met, and I don't want to share that in public, but he's got a great sense of humor too. But there he is, the world's smallest ship, even smaller than Mercury. And that is actually a bona fide spaceship right there you're looking at. It's going to be hard to beat that record for compact size for a ship. But all you need is propulsion, life support, and a person aboard, and that's what happened here. So there's the world's smallest spaceship, making history. They took a lot of chances on spacewalks since then, but they never lost anybody, knock on wood, so far. But this was untethered, no connection at all. He was out there free floating as a separate spaceship, hoping he could make it back to the mothership, and he did. I guess I'm not really sure what the guy on foot restraints was doing, but maybe he had a lasso or something he'd throw out there in case Captain McCandless started drifting away too far or something. I'm not really sure what he was there for, but they did put foot restraints on the end of the robot arm, and that gave them a lot of chance to get around and see and do things safely, as long as you were able to keep your feet in the straps there. There's Bruce just messing around in the payload bay. He's going back and forth and up and down and left and right and testing that thing out. I honestly don't think it ever flew again, but that's just a testament to how successful this test flight was. Because the reason for a test flight is to go out there and collect data, parameters, limits, and I think on this one flight, I think he was able to prove the ability. There's two spaceships in orbit together. That's probably the most gutsiest thing I've ever seen in space by a person, because if something would have gone wrong, there was really no way to bring him back. So he didn't suffer any, thrusters he couldn't shut off or things like that happened early in the space program, where you'd be spinning around and by wild jets or something like that, and that certainly would have been a risk. But everything stayed off until he turned it on, and when he turned it on, it worked as planned. So, a really great mission this was. He went on to fly many, many more flights, but this is probably in history the one that he likes to talk about the most, because, as I said, I think he's the only person that ever did it. And so here's the payload bays of Challenger closing. They always closed in the same order as design. Port first, followed by starboard. And everything looked really well this time. They got the good work out of Canada's arm. They got their satellites off, and they're coming back to Earth. With Bruce McCandless, I should add. Pilot coming down from the 180 to the 90 on the hack was Hoot Gibson. And Vance Brand would take over from the 90 to landing. From there, these guys are going to land on looks like KSC runway 33. I think this may have actually been the first time landing at Kennedy, at least for this crew. I can always tell which way they're coming in based on which way they're turning off the hack, either in the 28.5 or 51.6 inclination orbits. And so this has to be runway 15. At the Kennedy Space Center. So basically they're heading 150 degrees, which is roughly southeast. There's, in the background, the causeway from just north of there is where I've seen many, many launches. I saw many launches on the causeway. I can just look at this place and just know where everything is, because I've just been there so many times. But the first set of lights you see there is where they're aiming at, coming in directly, and then they begin their flare maneuver at a certain altitude based on the wind speed and direction on that day. They're bringing in over the runway and gears down, and I have a lot more to say about this landing strip later, but it's not very wide, and they've never flipped anything there, but you can tell it's Florida because you start seeing a lot more humidity off the wingtips. There they are, touchdown. And they're bringing it down, and nose gear touchdown. At first they had beryllium brakes, and later on they changed them out to carbon brakes. But I think that's because they had so many problems with blown tires and brake fires and that kind of thing. There's the chase plane taking off. Definitely Florida. You're looking to the west there, and here comes Vance Brand, Hoot Gibson, Ron McNair, and in the back there is the famous spacewalker, Captain McCandless. Vance is just such an awesome guy, just so humble. He's still living out there in California, hanging out with all the old test pilots from the Right Stuff days. I think he lives in Tahaki. I'll think of it. It's a place with all the wind farms up in the mountains. What a great flight that was. Okay. Next up will be Discovery, once again for Charlie Walker and his second flight. Like I said, sometimes this was in a range where they had a lot of DoD missions, so they tried to confuse everybody with all the crazy numbers. And here you go, liftoff and no liftoff. They have 10 seconds on the ground after they fire the main engines, and one was not working this time, so they saved the spacecraft, I guess both. And this was a really scary time to be on that cabin on top of all that fuel after you start lighting it up. They turned it around, got the engine problem fixed, tried again. Next time, after that first scare, there they go. Once the solids light, they have a really good confidence that you have 3 good main engines. You don't have a real problem if you lose an engine while the solids are running, and I'll explain that later. But if you can get the solids off, if you start losing a couple engines, you can just leave the other 2 on longer, and it takes about another minute and a half longer after you do an abort to orbit, and you can make it to orbit on 2 engines in about 9.5 minutes, which is about a minute longer than you take using 3. If they shut down earlier than that, then you have to probably try to shoot for a transatlantic landing site, which on the 28.5 degree orbit, which all these early flights were, will pretty much land you in Ben Guerir in Africa or Morocco, somewhere like that. They could do it. One thing I've always been very doubtful about is something they call RTLS, or Return to Launch Site, and I have a lot to say about that too. These were pretty much the same views you saw in the same time frame when Challenger was lost. Same cameras, same angles, different results. This is Discovery is a beautiful bird. This may be one of its first launches, and we will certainly carry it through the program. That's what you see from the ground from a spectator's view. In the later parts of the ascent, you start seeing a lot of differences in the formation of the trail. That's because of the different atmosphere it's going through. One thing you can really notice is the technology to watch this gets a lot better over time, but still that's amazing every time. And Vance was very glad to get that stack off, because that's the one thing he said that's different from Apollo Soyuz is that very first rough 2 minutes and 4 seconds of a solid burn. And here he comes back on the hack, or the heading alignment circle. I know you see humidity there, but I bet you already, just by looking at the angle, it's going to be Edwards. Coming in on final. This is before they had all the fancy heads-up displays and computer assistants and microwave landing systems, all that kind of stuff. These guys had to do it as the pilots that really would have to do it. And Charlie's just a great guy, and please spend some time with him at Spacefest. He'll just knock your socks off with his humor and stories. One thing you really can't tell looking at these is just what kind of dive bomb they're doing, because if you see these in person, you'd be like, it's like a lawn dart falling into the ground. At the last minute, they'll pull the nose up and go horizontal and land on the runway. Here we go with the flare. Just like the old lifting bodies, and that would be Edwards Air Force Base. Dryden is what NASA calls it, because they have their facility there where they park this thing after it lands and gets it back over to Kennedy. Yep, I bet you this is runway 17. Yep, it's runway 17. The reason I say that is because they're back on the off the runway, back on to the dry lake bed. And that's usually because of some kind of heavy weight they're bringing back, or they're testing out new brakes. Sure spent a lot of time there. I just love those people. Marianne Harness, Fred Brown, Jay Levine, all those great people out there that used to always keep me updated in ways that Kennedy never would. And here's another great guest at Spacefest. We just call him Colonel Bo. Also on his third flight will be Charlie Gibson. And Dr. Rhea Seddon-Gibson. Rhea Seddon is actually, I don't know if she was a physician before she started going up there, but she was hired by NASA to do medical research. That's what her specialty was, to see what happens in space to the human body. So she was hired as doing that, and she's very good at it. Matter of fact, she's legendary in the medical community. And so here's another reunion of crews that will all be at Spacefest. And they're off. Discovery flew, I don't know if it flew the most missions, but I know it spent the most time in space. A whole year over its 35-year run. And as time got better, so did the cameras, or at least what NASA was willing to release. And these were all beautiful launches. She's one of those astronauts, as well as Hoot Gibson, who after Challenger was lost, she decided that she's going to risk it and hope NASA got their act together after what was needed after the Rogers Commission, and she flew a couple more times. Even as America started to realize just how dangerous this thing could be. A couple of satellites out the payload bay. There she is. That's an Anomes 1 burn, and what happens then is they'll hit, I think, just 1/32 of 1G, but it's enough to move you around in there and bang your head if you're not careful. But I guess they actually announce it that when they're going to do these things. For some reason, this wonderful congressman, or correction, senator from Utah, no doubt on the SciTech committee, got himself a seat on this thing. I guess for oversight. But we see later that Senator Garn actually does have some aerospace capabilities, so he earned his seat. There's Dr. Rhea again. This is something that was probably very revolutionary at the time. Is when you do an ultrasound on your heart. I had one of these done last year after I had cancer before my surgery, just to make sure my heart was in good shape. And it's amazing technology. You can see your heart going in. You can see the Doppler going on in there, and watch the blood moving through, and watch the chambers all go up and down and in and out. And it's just amazing technology. It's all commonplace today as a NASA spinoff because of her work. I have a cousin that was actually on one of the Space Hab modules that she was involved with, and she was very sad to see that one get lost into Columbia later. And this is down in the med deck. It really is the mid deck because they have a deck below they use for storage, and that's where they dump the trash and things like that. And actually, when Columbia was lost, turned out to be one of the instrumental causes of breaking that thing apart and getting all that hot air in the cabin. Here's Charlie showing off again. He's such a great, funny guy. I love the guy to death. And once you meet him, you will too. Back then, after Apollo, the mid deck looked pretty big. Compared to Skylab, it wasn't so big, but it's big enough. Things look bigger in space, they tell me. They show the gyroscopic binoculars, what happens to them if you let them set free. They have a mind of their own. There's Dr. Rhea again. I give her $100 if she can do that. Well, maybe not. She can. Forget that one. On the ground. Very smart lady and just so nice. There's Senator Garden improving his value as an astronaut in the aerospace field. Good job. They did a lot of medical research up here, so that always involves blood draws and all sorts of studies in what happens to metabolism and bone density, that kind of thing. So she was busy up there. This was really, they saw very quickly how valuable she was, so they kept bringing her back for more. Now they're getting ready for the spacewalk, it looks like. She's such a nice person. If you get a book signed by both her and her husband, from what I hear, you get a big discount. But they're both going to be there. Great married couple, and they both did. I don't know if they were married back then or not, but they sure were later. But just a great couple both of them are. Of course, I just have to mention, as somebody who has a sister who's a doctor, and someone who knows what the life of an airline pilot is like. They never see each other, but when they do, I'm sure it's really great. But just the hours on these professions are so demanding. Hoot went on to fly Southwest of all things after NASA, and so you may have very well have had him as a airline pilot bringing you around the country, and later on you went and flew for something like Signature Air or one of these private jets companies. But him and Ron Franco, I'll tell you, two peas in a pod. This is a fly swatter that was very famous in the news. Dr. Seddon tried to turn on the satellite they had deployed. All it needed was somebody on the ground had left the switch in the wrong position. They just had to flip the switch and turn the thing on. And so they devised this fly swatter, and I can't even remember if it worked or not. But what I do remember is just how ingenious it was, trying to grab that switch on the fly with nothing in their minds going up before they encountered that problem. For all I know, it works just fine. Even to this day, I just don't know how it went, but it was just really brilliant. This looks like Kennedy Space Center just based on the sky. They're turning right, so that means they're going to land on runway 33. But I could be wrong. Like I say, you see a lot more moving around in the old days based on wind patterns and things like that, because this is before they had all those computer assisted landings and the pilots were really pilots. When it flies overhead, as it enters the heading alignment circle, you hear two sonic booms. And you can always, once in a while, see that thing flying over. But I'll tell you what, if you ever lose sight of it, you've lost sight of it, because it's flying so high and so fast as it crosses from the TAEM, or energy management portion, to the HAC. And that would be Kennedy. Runway 15. See, I guessed it right again. 33, I mean. This is runway 33 at the Kennedy Space Center. Later on, I got a lot of stories to tell you about that runway itself and how hard it is to watch landings there if you're not, even if you are right there on site. They put you behind a fence now if you're actually there, so filming is not this good. And if you're anywhere else other than just right there, those trees block your view. All you see is just the tail going by after landing. But at least you can usually see that. Out at Edwards, the couple of landings I saw there, you can see everything just fine, but it is very far away when it happens. Look at that blown tire. Whoops. I think that's probably one of the reasons they updated the brakes from beryllium to carbon, was because they were having so many problems with those tires.